Happy St. Andrew's Day. Before we begin, I know we are all in different places right now, but I want to acknowledge that at SFU Burnaby, we work on unceded Coast Salish territory, the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, and Coquitlam First Nations. I also want to acknowledge and thank the St. Andrews and Caledonian Society who have supported this annual event. And here is a message from Phil Beattie, the current president of the society. Phil Beattie says, the St. Andrews and Caledonian Society has been sponsoring this lecture for over 15 years. We recognize it is up to Canadians of Scottish heritage to keep our history and cultural identity alive. As part of the charitable organization, the SCCS and the United Scottish Cultural Society, St. Andrews is part of the decision-making and cultural outreach programs that support the musicians, dancers, and language interests of the much larger Scottish community. The BC Highland Games and Scottish Festival, Scotfest BC, and the St. Andrews Ball, among others. The SFU Center for Scottish Studies and Leith Davis in particular, have been very important members of that community. So the Center for Scottish Studies focuses on research connected to Scotland and Canadian Scottish connections. And we are very proud of our students who engage in that research. Tonight also gives us an opportunity to congratulate two students who have won scholarships sponsored by the community. Alyssa Bridgman is this year's recipient of the David and Mary Macquarie Graduate Fellowship in Scottish Studies. Alyssa is an MA student in the Department of English. Her fellowship project focuses on the cultural memory of Simon Fraser and includes both an academic paper as well as a digital humanities project, which will allow users to explore sites of cultural memory in Vancouver on an interactive map. Alyssa will be presenting her research publicly in the new year for the center, but please join me in congratulating her tonight. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the center's nominee for the Jennifer Proser Wade and Family Award in Scottish Studies, Emma Henderson. Emma is a fourth-year undergraduate student doing a double major in English and history. Emma has been researching the cultural memory of Mary Queen of Scots this year, and we've asked her to briefly share a little bit about her research. So Emma, I'll let you take it away.
Hi, thank you very much. Let me just open this up. So, hi, my name is Emma Henderson, and today I'll be presenting my directed studies project of Mary Queen of Scots in 18th century literature and cultural memory that I had the opportunity to do with Dr. Leith Davis this semester. So the project has included looking at primary sources of 18th century literature that focus on Mary Queen of Scots from Scottish and English writers from the period, as well as critical articles concerning both cultural memory and the cultural representation of Mary Stuart during the 18th century. Just to kind of briefly touch on what is the concept of cultural memory. Theories of cultural memory allow us to understand the continuing relevance of a subject or event over the centuries. The subject is reused and reinvented, with certain aspects being continuously reiterated, while other points are omitted in the continued narrations. When examining Mary Queen of Scots through the lens of cultural memory, it shows how her life has been reinvented in many different ways, but with the key ideas of her romantic weakness and her opposition to Elizabeth I being used each time we notice. Here is a slide of some of the works I had the opportunity of reading this semester from writers such as Eliza Haywood, William Robertson, Sophia Lee, Jane Austen, and Robert Burns, each giving their own different kind of stance on Mary Queen of Scots. And just to kind of point out, in the SFU Special Collections, they have a copy of the first edition of Eliza Haywood's translation of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, being the secret history of her life and the real causes for all her misfortunes, that I had the opportunity of getting to read firsthand. So if anyone ever has the opportunity to go into the special collections, I highly recommend getting to read that yourself. And when looking at Mary Queen of Scots today, we also have to acknowledge how modern contemporary films have held the continued interest in her. We see with each modern adaptation that they depict key historical events in the life of Mary Queen of Scots that are continued by the cultural memory of her, with each film creating its own image, contributing to the continued narration of the story of Mary Queen of Scots. I'd like to thank you all for giving me the chance to present just a little bit of what I am doing this semester, and thank you for listening.
All right, thank you, Emma. So our main speaker tonight is Dr. Leith Davis. Leith Davis is professor of English at Simon Fraser University. She is the author of Acts of Union, Scotland and the Negotiation of the British Nation, and Music, Postcolonialism, and Gender, The Construction of Irish Identity, 1724 to 1874, as well as co-editor of Scotland and the Borders of Romanticism, and Robert Burns and Transatlantic Culture. She has just completed another book entitled Mediating Cultural Memory in Britain and Ireland, 1688 to 1745. And this talk is drawn from her research completed for that project. Leith has just been awarded an Amundsen Teaching Fellowship for 2021. Congratulations, Leith. And her talk tonight is called What News? 18th Century News Media and the 1715 Jacobite Rising in Cultural Memory. And just to say that if you do have questions tonight, and I hope that many of you do, we'll have time for Leith to answer questions at the end. But if you have questions or comments that come up during the talk, you can put them into the chat, and Leith will have some time after the lecture to answer them. And if you could just do a quick check of your microphones to make sure they're all muted, that would be great. And at that, I will let you take it away, Leith.
Okay, thank you so much, Erin. Can you all hear me? Just thumbs up is good. You don't have to put your microphones on. Yay, excellent. Okay, well, thank you so much for everybody who's joining us tonight at this public talk. It's not the kind of celebration we would choose, but it's still a pleasure to see you remotely on a screen, and also to share this research. So to get beyond my academic cell here at home and reach out and share the research that I've been doing. So thank you again, Erin, for offering to serve as the MC in the midst of what I know is a pretty crazy teaching semester for you. And also congratulations again to Alyssa and Emma. Their work has really been so interesting and just well worth supporting. So I also want to give a huge shout out to Rebecca Salustris, who helped organize this talk. Rebecca is the Department of English Communications Director, and together with our RA Taylor Breckles, our student research assistant, Rebecca has been just doing a phenomenal job with Scottish Studies Center social media, our Facebook, our Twitter, and our Instagram. So thank you so much for that, Rebecca, much, much appreciated. So the talk that I am presenting tonight is, as Erin said, from a book that I've just completed. And I'm sharing a section of that on the 17 Rising with you. I'm very aware, speaking of mediation, of the limitations of this Zoom mediation format. So I've made a concerted effort to just whittle down the argument as much as I can. And it will last about 30 minutes or so. If you haven't had enough at the end of that time period, I welcome you to contact me and I can send you the entire 55 pages of the chapter. But I'm hoping this gives you at least a little bit of a teaser and share some of the exciting research that I've been able to do. Okay, so with this Zoom setup, I've got my slides on one screen and I've got some notes on the other. So just give me 1 second here as I go to find the slides and share my screen. And we're going back to find, oops, screen sharing has stopped. Hang on, let's try that one more time. All right, going back to play from the start. All right, beginning, what news? 18th century news media and the 1715 Jacobite rising in cultural memory. So this is a talk about how new media, it's a talk about a struggle around a regime change. It's a talk about the refusal of a segment of the population to accept a head of state. And it's a talk about how new media help shape political events. Putting all that together, wow, it sounds scarily like I'm going to talk about 2020, but don't worry, I'm not. I'm talking about 1715. So in this case, the new head of state is George I of Hanover, who had just been crowned King of Great Britain and Ireland the previous year in 1714. And the population that is resistant to this change are the Jacobites. So these are people who are committed to returning the Stuarts to the throne. And for those of you who know about the Jacobites in 1688, or don't know about the Jacobites in 1688, James II of England, 7th of Scotland, fled England, and the Stuarts, people who were supporting Stuarts after that point, became known as Jacobites after the Latin for James Jacobus. So the 1715 enterprise, then the rising, is an attempt to put James II of England, 7th of Scotland's son, on the throne. And there's a picture of him in a very big hair there, big hair wig. Now, this rising involved actual or planned conflicts throughout England and Scotland. A number of those regional risings were intercepted, but in Scotland, Lord Mar raised the standard of James in Perth and went on to seize a number of victories. James Francis Edward Stuart arrived himself in Scotland in December. By that time, the Jacobites had already faced significant losses at Sheriffmuir and Preston in November. So the rising ended in failure and James left for France in February 1716. But it's important to understand about this, that this is a series of eruptions taking place all over Britain. So in the west of England, in northern England, the borders, lowland Scotland, as well as the Scottish Highlands. And it's important to see it as a genuine threat to the government. So, new head of state, resistant population, the new medium at this point is print. And print in the early 18th century is taking center stage in the midst of other older media in a media ecology. So due to an expansion of the print marketplace, changes in censorship laws, the increases in number of presses, changes to transportation networks, and increased literacy, Britain is experiencing what scholars call print saturation. So print is becoming normalized at this point. And we can think of the equivalent in our own day when we think about our shift to the digital. We're in the midst of this change to a more digital saturation in this case. Okay, so the 1715 then has got bad press. And Daniel Shecky comments on the way that the 1715 rising has been overlooked in history by academics and by historians. And he compares it to, as he calls it, a damp squib, which is a British expression meaning a wet firecracker. So in this case, something that fails to live up to expectations. In other words, the 1715 rebellion really doesn't make it onto the stage. Instead, it's outstaged by the 1745, for example. And now, especially after Outlander, people might know about Jacobites, but they will know about 1745. The 1715 rising, however, remains more obscure for people. So there have been really stellar work, there has been really stellar work by historians looking at the details of the 1715 rising. As a literary historian and as somebody who's particularly interested in media history, this is the question that I posed. When and how did this major political and military challenge become a damp squid in cultural memory? As I've already suggested, it was actually a significant political threat. So how did it become reduced to become less of a threat and indeed to fall off the radar of so many people? So my talk today then looks at this intersection, the 1715 rising, media change, and cultural memory. I'm going to break this down into 4 parts. And so after each part, I suggest maybe a stretch or something. So I'm starting off old media, part 1. Just hearing someone's microphone there, so maybe we should have a look at that. Demands for bedtime, it looks like there.
She started sprinting. Let's see if I can get her with this. Bonnie, sit.
Okay. All right. The joys of remote lecturing. All right. So I'll start off by considering the old media. I'm going to look in particular at a medium that you might not be familiar with called manuscript newsletters. I'm going to shift to look at newspapers and how they represented the news of the 1715 rising. And then I'll look at how the news that was circulating at the time became consolidated very soon, actually during the 1715 and very soon afterwards, particularly in popular histories that were printed at the time. And I'll finish up with some conclusions about media and cultural memory. Okay, so let's start. Part 1, the old media of 1715. Now, we should think that at this point, many people, of course, most people we could say, were continuing to receive their news by word of mouth. So news was passed, for example, around coffee house tables at home, churches, markets. These were all sources for news. But while this was sufficient for local news, the 1715 rebellion, as I've suggested, the rising was different in that it took place over a number of geographical areas. So news from the horse's mouth, as it were, was hard to come by when that horse was up in Scotland or Northumbria. Hence, non-face-to-face media were indispensable. One of the crucial forms of media operating right up to the time and during the time of the 1715 rebellion rising has been the manuscript newsletter. And these were like newspapers, but they predated newspapers. They predated printed news. And there's only kind of recently that scholars have been focusing on these. And I've been lucky enough to do some work on these. So I thought I'd share a little bit of this with you. So these manuscript newsletters were of 2 kinds. On the one hand, there were newsletters that were commercial newsletters. So these would be written out and sent to people by subscription. People would sign up, pay a fee, and they would receive these. There were also official manuscript newsletters, and these were written by secretaries at the Secretary of State's office. So these were official from Whitehall, and they were sent out to a limited number of individuals with whom the government wished to maintain connections. usually sent in anticipation of news in return. Okay, so important, vital to remember here is that during this time period, this is the beginning, leading into print saturation, manuscript news was, according to Ian Atherton, more accurate, less censored, and regarded as more authoritative. Interesting, right? We think of print as having an authority. Back at the beginning of the 18th century, it was manuscript. But let's remember this because it's going to change. As we see, print begins to become more important during this 1715 rising. Okay, so this is the fun stuff I got to work on recently. There are at the Folger Shakespeare Library a collection, an archive of these Newdigate family manuscript newsletters. And they date back from 1674 and they go right through to 1715. So they're a complete and comprehensive, I shouldn't say complete, there are gaps in them, but they're a comprehensive archive of manuscript newsletters. And unfortunately for me, they stop September 29th, 1715, right when things are getting more interesting in terms of the rising. But they still give us important information about how events are represented up to that point. So I'm going to draw on these, and I have tons of examples, but I've whittled them down just to show you what these were actually like and how they represented the news from the 1715. So here's an example. And you can see by looking at this, it is like a letter, right? It begins, I don't know if you can see up in that left-hand corner, it looks like a YR, it's actually an SIR, it's Sir. So addressing Newdigate, Richard Newdigate as Sir, and it's got the place of writing, London, and it says July 2nd, 1715. So these are like letters, but they are interesting because they're like a compendium, sort of a shorter form of news, and they give the greatest hits of what's going on that they take from other oral and manuscript sources. So they include phrases like "we hear" or "advices say" or "letters from France say," and they are designed to keep individuals up to date. They're sent out on regular days according to the postal days, the days that the post is sent out. And they are sent to Richard Newdigate, who eagerly, one can imagine, consumed them, eager to find out what's going on in the world at this point. So what do they include? Okay, well, there's a lot of news about Parliament, and there's also news that identifies Jacobite activities. So for example, June 21st, 1715, the newsletter writer talks about riots and tumults in Manchester, Kidderminster, and Wolverhampton. And he also notes an account from Glasgow of the seizure of 3 chests laden with muskets, bayonets, swords, and pistols said to belong to a laird of a Highland clan. So we can see the beginnings, we can see the real roots of the conflict that will develop later on in these newsletters. These newsletters also point out specific individuals who are taken and imprisoned. And in June 16th, for example, there is a note about a French schoolmaster who was whipped from Stocks Market to Aldgate for making disparaging remarks on the king. Interestingly enough, the newsletter also notes as soon as he was taken from the car, an abundance of people gave him money and others treated him with wine. So it sounds as if he actually had some friends who had Jacobite leanings. And that's really interesting as well. These newsletters frequently comment on people who have been seized for toasting the Stuart monarchs, the Stuart ex-monarchs, current monarchs, pretenders, et cetera, et cetera. So they indicate then that there is a great deal of activity, Jacobite activity going on. This is a nation that's unsettled in its urban centers, as well as its remote regions, in its university towns, as well as in the nation's capital. By August, however, things are heating up, specifically in Scotland. They've been particularly noting here then, news comes from expresses. These are letters that come quickly, not by the regular post. News is sporadic and contradictory accounts occur. So the newsletter writers will say one thing and then contradict it in the next letter, or sometimes even at the end of the letter that they're writing. These news, after all, are focused on London, and so they tell us a great deal about the mustering of the troops down there. But it's significant that these newsletters are dependent on a network of news gatherers based mostly in London and Europe, and as a focus primarily on these events in London and Parliament. These news writers were often at a loss to obtain information about what was happening in the outlying areas of their own nation. Okay. So they are conveying news about the uprising and about the dissent. Interestingly enough, these official newsletters are also containing, they're limiting the numbers of people who have access to that information. So a specific and exclusive elite community are the recipients of these newspapers. The news travels then between in this community that is an exclusive kind of community. All right. Let me move on to part two, but just stop for 1 second here, and give us all a chance maybe to stretch, look away from the screen. That's really important with Zoom calls, right? So make sure that you aren't just focusing on the screen, and then that allows you to focus more on the screen as we go forward. All right, so the second part, I've looked at these newsletters then. We've seen that they are representing this crisis, evolving crisis, to an elite group of readers through the affordances of letters, scribbled news. Let's move on to consider the representation of the news in the new medium, the newspaper. Now, I should say, printed newspapers are not a new form in 1715. What is new is the sheer number of them that are available. So let's take a look at the numbers. This was, in fact, the first major domestic crisis to occur since the expansion of the newspaper press. What did that look like? Well, here's a list of the newspapers that were published during the 1688 revolution. There it is. 1, the London Gazette. It's an official government newspaper, however, so it's carefully crafted. What about newspapers published during the 1715 to 16 rising? Well, here they are. You can see exponential increase in the numbers of newspapers that are circulating with the news at this point. So what did these newspapers look like, these early newspapers? Well, interestingly enough, they also credit oral and scribal sources. So we can see, for example, in the Daily Courant for the 1st of December, 1715, we see letters from Chester. They write from Newcastle. From Edinburgh, it is advised. So they were still very much dependent upon representing themselves as gathering news from oral and from scribal sources. They're using that to establish their authority. How do they depict the news? Well, like the manuscript newsletter, they also represent the events that are taking place, this escalating crisis. And they also represent the individual acts and group acts of Jacobites during this time period. So here's just a example. Flying Post of 11th to 14th June 1715 notes that the Jacobites are making a bonfire and ringing bells in Whitechapel, and the strolling about of several scoundrels with cockades in their hats on what they call the pretender's birthday. Okay, The cockades would be the white cockades. These are Stuart supporters strutting around, and the newspaper is taking note of this and sharing this with the population. However, with the newspapers, they needed to be more careful because there were frequent prosecutions of editors and publishers. So we don't see, for example, the story of the French person who's whipped. We don't see the news about him being given money and wine after he's let out of the car. That would seem to be too subversive. But we can get clues about what's going on. And indeed, people who were reading at the time also got clues from instances like the newspaper gives information about bills to contain unrest. So for July 28th, the Daily Courant notes the publication the day earlier of His Majesty's Royal Proclamation for suppressing riots and rebellious tumults. These kind of things suggest that there are riots and rebellious tumults that need to be suppressed. And they give us, as I suggest, a kind of clue of what's going on. There also begin to be published oaths of loyalty. And again, they give us clues about the necessity for oaths. So oaths of loyalty pour in from all the corners of Britain. That suggests there is a reason, an important reason, that there needs to be these oaths of loyalty coming in. All right, so what begins to happen gradually, kind of starting again, August, September, newspapers start to have more information about the rising than the newsletters. Interestingly enough, they have more news devoted to the Jacobite cause, and they start to expand. So they have eyewitness accounts and letters. They're starting to become more timely, accurate, and authoritative sources of news. So we're beginning to see a shift in media at this point. However, the newspapers also, interestingly enough, shape the news and they share the news differently. And I just want to look again at some examples here for ways that these newspapers do shape and share the news. And we need to think about how the media that we consume, really the material form of that media affects its meaning. So how about the news in these newspapers? Well, for one thing, in the newspapers, the news about the Jacobite rising appears on the last page. It is domestic news, and newspapers, following the example of newsletters, include the domestic news that they have last. It's the freshest advices, so it's the last news. It's significant, however, and the newspaper is different because newsletters don't have advertisements. Newspapers do. And so we find on the pages of the newspapers, for example, this one in the Daily Courant, you can see information about the taking of prisoners at Preston and the their distribution around various prisons is shared on the same page as people get information about theater. What's going on at Drury Lane? What's playing at Lincoln's Inn Fields? They get information about consumer goods. How about that? Cask of brandy at the coffee house in Lombard Street. How about those 50 hegs of tobacco? We can see how the news then jostles for place with these advertisements. Newspapers also repeat the same items of news. So the Daily Courant, for example, information in the Daily Courant appears in the London Courant, it appears in the Postman, it appears in the weekly packet. It's repeating almost verbatim the same reports, and these circulate between these many different newspapers. So my point about this is that these newspapers create this sense of news as consumable units of constantly circulating information. And what we see then is an example of information overload. There's nonstop information about the crisis erupting in multiple locations, and it seems like it's never going to stop. This is indeed a crisis. And of course, added to this is the fact that it's occurring all over the place at different points and at different times. The newspapers, moreover, share this news differently. They share it with an elite group, yes, same as the newsletters, but also with those of middling rank and the lower classes, even by hearsay, learn about the news in the newspapers. So newspapers are this one-way information to an anonymous audience about an endless conflict that's circulating at this time. And the point I'd like to make is that in the newspapers, this is far from a damp squib. This is fireworks going off everywhere. This rising was indeed a significant threat, and it is being represented this way through this new kind of news medium, the newspaper. Okay, time to maybe stretch a little bit, look away, flap your arms, shrug your shoulders, do the ergonomic shuffle, because we're moving on to part 3. So I want to look at how what I would call arguably not a damp squid, but an explosion of a crisis. How did this become managed? Well, interestingly enough, it was managed through other works of print culture that were also circulating at the time. And these works took the approach of condemning the newspaper at the same time as a number of them stole from the newspapers. They represented the newspaper reports, but they did it in such a way, in such a manner as to minimize the earlier threat. So a couple of examples here. Richard Steele, in his periodical essay form, The Town Talk, which was started in January of 1716, he specifically starts a periodical magazine, we can think of it, in order to, as he says, counteract the impertinencies which are premeditated by the authors of daily or weekly papers. In other words, he's trying to downplay what is represented in the news. The Historical Register, containing an impartial relation of all transactions, foreign and domestic, similarly condemns the news, and in particular, it condemns the periodicity of it as it comes out frequently. The Historical Register claims it could not possibly get a global picture by presenting these little sound bites of information. And it has, I guess, what we would call a early kind of discussion of fake news or false news, as it was called back then, where the editors say newspapers and lies are become almost synonymous terms. Sounds like that has some other resonances in some other place too. Okay, so periodical essays like those of Steele are refashioning the news. Works like the Historical Register are also refashioning the news as it appears in the newspapers. Additionally, we have popular histories of the rebellion, and these come out right on the heels of the rebellion as it's finishing. I'm calling it the rebellion rising as well, depending on whose side you're on. So what these are basically an interesting way in which they take from the newspapers, for example, the complete history of the late rebellion, again, basically lifts material from the newspapers, but it puts it into a narrative format. It erases everything about letters or advices or we hears, all of the stuff that makes news at the time. And instead, it creates a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and a logical end. And the idea is that by putting this information in this continuous narrative, these histories also minimize the threat that it actually posed. because there is a conclusion. They suggest, in other words, that the 15 Rising is much less compelling, much less dangerous than it actually was. After all, it came to an end, didn't it? Adding to these histories that came out in just after 1715, which minimized the threat, are also the histories that come out after this 45. And interestingly enough, many of these look back on the 15 and they present it as kind of a first chapter. You can see here in the review of the two late rebellions, a succinct account of the rebellion in the year 1715. So that's kind of short and sweet. And then the rebellion in 1745. So these later histories then are representing the 1715 basically as a precursor or prequel, we could think, to the later and much more interesting and final, they hope, Jacobite rising of 1745. Together then, these histories, these periodicals that use the news also knit the separate threads of the 1715 Jacobite rising into a single rising, and they minimize the threat in 1715. They minimize it retroactively. So they purposefully shape this 1715 into a non-event, or in Shecky's words, a damp squib. And by doing so, they reinforce the power of the Hanoverian government as never under threat in the first place. Okay, so we're on part 4, and this is my brief conclusion here. And I'm actually going to just stop sharing at this point and come back to my camera just to finish off with some conclusions about this. And then I'd be happy to take any questions you might have or comments that you might also want to share too. So in my talk today, I've examined the way that this initial inscription of the 1715 rising took place. And I've suggested that it started as this kind of loose, baggy series of events in newsletters and newspapers. Over time, it, however, became a site of memory as it was reiterated and adapted to new circumstances and to new genres in the years following the rising. So while it was definitely something to be afraid of while it is unfolding, it's in the aftermath of this rising that we get the story that suggests that it was logically going to end anyway. Newspapers, although they had conveyed the considerable dangers of the rising at the time, were also very important here because they represent the memory as insignificant. They're repurposed and refashioned. So an examination of this 1715 rising, I'm suggesting, gives us an opportunity to see the important role that Jacobite politics and ideology played here. We search behind the histories, dig back, see what was history like when it was unfolding. We can see there was a lot more dissent than we might think by the fact that the 1715 rising has been so swept under the carpet. It was deliberately so. Most importantly, my talk has indicated the ways in which the creation of cultural memory is a complex process involving layers and technologies of mediation. I've suggested the early 18th century constituted a unique moment for the intersections between print, memory, and the nation in Britain. Specifically, I suggest the spread of print also encouraged an increasing self-consciousness about the way events would be remembered in the future. For better or for worse, people became more aware of the possibilities of print for commemorating events. This self-consciousness about commemoration and media is something we understand, I think, only too well in our current moment, as so many of us attempt to document and curate our experience of the COVID-19 pandemic so future generations can understand. With new digital technologies of mediation, each moment becomes a potential future moment of the past. each individual potential agent in the creation of that memory. Looking back to the way the original representation of the 1715 Rising was managed through later print technology then reminds us only too well of Astrid Erll's astute observation. I'm going to leave you with this. As she says, the medium is the memory. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Leith, for that wonderful talk, and thank you all. If anybody has a question, you can go ahead and ask it in either the chat box, or I think that there may be a function here where you can raise your hand, or if you even just wave your hand, I'll try to see you on the screen here and call on you to ask it. But I think I'll kick things off with questions and ask you, Leith, what you know about the culture of reporting. So there's the print publication aspect of this. What can you tell us about what's going on with people who are actually doing the writing and doing the reporting, and how they're thinking about events as they unfold?
Yeah, that's a great question, Erin. So, so there's different stages to the reporting of news. We've got the collection of news that happens through letters, writing, manuscript, sharing. I suggested the manuscript newsletters are sent out to people on the understanding that they will send news back. So news becomes this shared experience. And the newsletter writers working in Whitehall then take the news and basically do, as I suggested, a little précis with it. There's a cadre of about 6 different secretaries working in Whitehall, writing out the news and sending it out. So it's this kind of bringing in the post, looking through it, sifting it, writing out the news and sending it out accordingly. So that's the newsletters. Newspaper reporting, again, when we're talking about events that are happening in the north, in Scotland, in other remote areas, so much of this is also through letters. And so scribal news, reports, letters, writing like that is such a crucial aspect of news back at this time. When we think of news, we think perhaps more printed news, but it's actually manuscript letters that are really creating, giving the news at this point.
Hello, it's Scylla. I have a question.
Go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi there. After the consolidation or the suppression then of the 1715 uprising via newsletters and newspapers and so on, what happened in between 1715 and 1745 in terms of how that the 1715 event was referred to? There must have been independent newspapers that would have something to say about that down the road. Do you know?
Yeah, you're asking again a really great question. And I think you're also putting your finger on a really interesting aspect of Jacobite studies, which is, I think when we think of studying Jacobites, we think of these moments of crisis, right? 1715, 1745. And it's almost as if nothing, we don't think of what happens, what fills in the blank there. So that's very much a function of how history was written and recorded. What's happening throughout this time period is people's activities, plottings, ideas for how to go forward with promoting the Jacobite cause, and all of this is taking place. So very interesting. Politics has tended to, a political particular Hanoverian perspective has tended to erase much of that. But if we go back and look at these newspapers, if we look at what's happening, we see a little bit more of that. And looking at the newsletters too, we see some of that inside. So it presents the Jacobites not as people who had these moments, but rather as a coherent, a kind of ecology of their own making. And people would be in various ways adherents to the Jacobite cause. Some people would be ready to pick up a weapon Other people might support the cause, but wouldn't be so active in it. So yeah, so what's happening between 1715 and 1745 is an awful lot. It's not like they go away and come back in 1745. And it's certainly, I think, a function of the way that history had been written, that we don't think about the gaps that occurred in between these moments of crisis.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple questions in the chat. Aaron, did you want to read them out?
Yeah.
Or?
So Peter Richards asks, you mentioned coffee houses. Were coffee houses as ubiquitous in Scottish cities as they were in London at the time, or did that come later, or not at all?
Oh yeah, that's a good question too, and thank you for that. Yeah, so London's the center of a lot of coffee houses, and absolutely during this time period, the coffee houses were places where news was shared, and people would debate about news. So it's a little bit like Starbucks, but on steroids, with people sharing ideas and having arguments, and they were loud. They were places where people were indeed arguing and sharing news. So much happened in the coffee houses. In terms of coffee houses in Scotland, my sense was there are coffee houses, I believe, not to the extent that there would be in London. And London had 2,000. It was a crazy amount of coffee houses at this time period. And each one of those coffee houses would be associated with a certain kind of profession, or would be a certain kind of actors would go to some, lawyers to others. So they would kind of have their little club that would gather in those places. But the Scottish ones is a great question, and I'd like to know more about that. I can't speak absolutely with certainty on that, but my sense is probably not as developed.
Yeah, and there was a question before that from Neil Carroll. I don't know, it says, what corresponding poems or songs were written about 1715, and is the paucity of them contribute to the low profile that the rebellion has?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. That's also a great question. I'm actually finding a lot of songs from the time period, poetry, novels, and many of these are in collections, archives. They're handwritten, so they are less visible than some of the other ones from the 1745, for example, were collected in printed works in the early 19th century. So there were works that were songs. There were also there's a lot of material in Gaelic, right? And those exist in the archives too. So I'm not sure it's such a paucity. It's certainly a paucity of things that have become shared and part of the cultural memory. But I'm convinced there's more and more out there in those archives. And the exciting thing for me to be doing this research now, even though we're in a lockdown, there's so much more that is digitized, that's available. So you can have a look at these. The Beinecke has wonderful collections. Harvard has wonderful collections of these manuscripts. There's more and more material that's becoming available. And I think it's really helping us to understand in a different manner what we had thought was happening during this time period, because so much was happening with scribal culture.
So
I would be happy to share.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I'd be happy to share the research that I find about both poems and other things that are also circulating at this time at a later date when I have more information on that.
Great. And so we have two questions from Caitlin McGinnis. One is, they're actually both regarding the Newdigate newsletters. So the first is, in 1689, do the newsletters report on the Jacobite rising in Scotland? And then the second question, is there any indication why the newsletters end in September 1715? What's
Hi,
going on there?
Caitlin. Yeah, thank you for those questions. Juicy archival questions. Oh my God, yes. So, so one of the gaps that exists in this Newdigate collection is in 1688 and 1689. There's just it's like, oh, I think there's March and, oh, I think October. But my sense is, wow, things are pretty unstable in the government. So whoever's writing these newsletters, the Secretary of State, a lot is happening. Maybe they weren't sure about what they wanted to send out, or maybe they were lost or filed somewhere else, impossible to know. So I wish, maybe we'll find them one day, those newsletters from 1688. And why did they stop September 29th, 1715? And that's also an excellent question, and I don't know the answer. I know newsletters stopped to become as important around this time, a little bit later. Richard Newdigate, the third baronet, and that's the person who was receiving these newsletters, he wasn't as much of a news junkie. His father was. His father collected everything, all newspapers he could, newsletters, really wanted to keep abreast of things. He was also a crazy businessman who had all kinds of schemes for making money as well. But the third baronet wasn't quite such a news junkie, so that he just stopped. Did he have a political disagreement at that point? I know there are newsletters, because I have a colleague who works on them, that were sent to Wigton. So I know there is an archive of other newsletters, and I am longing to get my hands on those and have a look at those too. But yeah, those are great questions, intriguing questions, Caitlin. Maybe one day we'll know. I don't have the answers right now.
We have a question here from Jennifer. Was anything said in European papers about events that pertained to 1715 in Scotland?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I wish you guys were, wish we could talk about this so much more, and this would be wonderful to be able to do some more research on. I haven't looked at the European newspapers, newsletters either. And so I can't, again, speak knowledgeably about that, but I would love to know about this, what was being written in France, for example. I think that would be a really interesting project to look at. And you'd have to go to France and search out some manuscript newsletters at the time period. Yeah, I should say, yeah, England was remarkable in having this many newspapers that were published. You don't find that in other places at the time period. It's really quite remarkable. So, but there are definitely papers and newsletters that one would need to look at to figure that out.
I just have another question for you. I'm also really interested in media history.
I know,
Leith,
yeah.
and just how significant is the shift to print newspapers, just in a much, even beyond just the question of how it reports rebellions and such, but just in terms of media history, how important is that shift to newspaper reporting versus the kind of pamphlet writing and that sort of thing that was kind of routine since, I mean, increasingly so from, you know, the previous century? How important is it that newspapers are starting to be printed around now, around that period?
Yeah, absolutely, Erin. So I think it's vital, and I think, as I suggested, these newspapers are doing something really different with creating a sense of an anonymous audience. They're giving a large number of people access to information, and there's a way that they are also validating people's desire for news, right? One of the interesting things up to 1695 is that newspapers are suppressed from the early Charles II has a newspaper but no other newspapers are allowed to be printed. They're government newspapers. Now, there's a couple of points where there becomes less rigorous for various reasons that I won't go on to. So all of a sudden, there's a sort of collection of newspapers that creep out. But generally, government's very interested in kind of controlling access to news, access to political news. And so this is a really interesting time period. And I should also say that 1695, there was a lapse of the Licensing Act. So that meant that people who were printing things didn't need to go through government sources before printing to get them authorized. They didn't have to do that. Now, they could still be prosecuted afterwards if the government didn't like what they said, but they didn't have to go specifically through a government official to get agreement and authorization. So newspapers are huge. And I think pamphlets go along with that as well, right? So the pamphlets, political pamphlets that people are consuming at the same time are commenting on the newspapers. They're commenting on things that are happening. And we see much more of, this sort of development of what Habermas calls a public sphere that's taking place, where people are discussing news, political news, matters that are matters of state. So yes, a huge change.
Great, thank you. And Neil Carroll has an interesting question here just about technology. Are there significant technological advances in the 30 years between 1715 and 1745?
Yeah, that's a great question, Neil. No, there's not. There are not really a whole lot of differences in the press. The way that printing is done is pretty much the same from Gutenberg until the steam press, really, in the 19th century. But so much more is changing. So we've got a more literate population. We've got presses that start up in different places all over Britain. We've got a population eager for reading. And we've also got these transportation networks. So things can be taken to different places and news can be transported much more easily. So all of these things really come together, and we see throughout the 18th century, as I was suggesting, movement to a print saturation.
Leith,
so much so. Yes.
Leith, would another reason for that be the fact that after 1715, you ended up with an entrepreneurial group that was actually making money off these newspapers, and there was a vested interest in getting as much information out there as possible. I mean, we see that was the beginning of what we see now, but that would have a lot to do, I'm sure, with the number of newspapers that were out there. It was
Absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Thanks for bringing that up, Mike. That's a great point. There are people from the get-go making money off this. So definitely, if people want news, there will be people there finding that news for them. And I think that's also perhaps part of this criticism of the newspapers, that it is associated with this group of people who just want to get the news out there, and people that are critiquing it think that the news should be shaped into these wider arguments or wider narratives that can be more easily controlled. So, yeah.
Question from Kay Sutherland. Did the Scottish newspapers after 1715 have a different tone in their reporting compared with the London papers?
Oh, that's a good question, Kate. I know during the 1745, the Scottish papers were definitely, there's some pro-Jacobite papers. And Charles Edward actually, Bonnie Prince Charlie in Edinburgh, used the press there. So he published works from the press. So there was pro-Jacobite newspapers in 1745. Did that change in 1715, from 1715 to 1745? I'd have to look at that more. That's a really interesting question. Have to go back and have a look at those and see what we could see. You guys have so
Right.
many good questions. And
Excellent
and
questions.
here.
And I'm scanning over all of the thumbnails here to see if I see any waving hands for a final question. Well,
Actually,
Leith,
we
thank you
have,
very much.
sorry,
Yes,
we
go
have
ahead.
one more.
Okay.
Yeah, let me just put my video back on. It says, did the audience for newspapers, was it different than for manuscripts? Does that have something to do with wanting to minimize the news of the rebellion? This is from Doe.
Yeah, so manuscript newsletters are expensive. They're expensive. There's only a few of them. There's fewer of them, and the people who receive them have to be able to afford these manuscript newsletters. So they are an elite group of people, or they're connected to the government, as the Newdigate newsletters suggest. So definitely, we've got a different audience that the newsletters are being aimed for. And absolutely, the newspapers are indiscriminate. Mike suggested the entrepreneurs, those entrepreneurs will sell those papers to anybody who wants to buy them. So there is a huge difference in the audience that's being created. So absolutely, I think part of that, what I've been looking at, is this desire to manage the news for a population that's eager to hear everything. So the pamphlets and the histories afterwards are trying to damp things down, and making that what was a huge threat, significant threat to the nation, making it appear indeed much less alarming than it was in the midst of things. So the importance then of taking what was happening with the newspapers, putting into these histories, shaming newspapers, reflecting poorly on newspapers, also has this impact of promoting the Hanoverian government and promoting the policies of the government at that point, which is important, of course. So yeah, great question. Thank you.
Well, fantastic. And I won't thank you all for coming out tonight because we are meeting via Zoom, but thank you all for joining us on virtually and being here for Leith's talk. And thank you, Leith, for a very wonderful talk, and great to see all of you. And join me in giving a round of applause from our many multitude of locations here around the globe. Thank you very much, Leith. Well done.
Thank you so much. And happy St. Andrew's Day to everybody. I wish we could raise a dram together in person. We'll look forward to doing that next year when we can actually gather. But so great to see so many of you. Take good care of yourselves, and I hope to see you in person next year, 2021, right?
At the St. Andrew's Ball.
There you go, Phil. Yeah, I would love to be dancing at this point.
Right. Okay.
Thank you, Leith.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Lee.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night. Bye.